frankly, the patient had negligible options. There were very few super specializations. Private sector in healthcare was hardly there. State-supported hospitals were a few. And I think literally millions would have lost lives which could have been otherwise saved. Partly, I believe that two of our very important social sectors, education and healthcare, were hit by the hangover of the regulatory regime. Almost parallelly was the journey of the state of educational institutions, because till about approximately the same time that I referred to, there was very little participation of the private sector and private institutions in educational institutions. And somehow, as a hangover of that policy, the impression was that it was only the prerogative and the responsibility of the state to look after these two very vital social sectors. And the state had no resources. If we look back from 1947 to 1991, our only contribution to the global economy was that we gave them an idiom of that 2 to 3% growth rate, which they sarcastically referred to as the Hindu rate of growth. And with 2 to 3% growth rate in a regulatory regime and an erroneous attitude that it's the state's prerogative and the state was without resources, we could not have been but in that state where we were during those periods, the decades of the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s. I think the very important break came when we decided to open up. And both these sectors started growing. And today, as we look back at the last 27 years, I think in both the growth and the private sector participation has been quite satisfactory. But it needs to be faster because of the size of our population and the number of patient population that we have. As I look at it, even though health predominantly was in the domain of the state governments, it was never a top priority item in many states. And therefore, establishment of institutions of excellence essentially over the years has been attempted at places by the central government. And under the schemes of the central government, plus the own resources of the state, some apparatus has been created. The private sector institutions, many of them of excellence, have concentrated in or around the metros and are now moving to the tier 2 cities. And therefore you have a vast countryside which still has facilities both of the state as also as far as the private sector is concerned, which is lacking. And then of course you have the income disparities. And besides income disparities, the pressure on incomes being so much that we had substantially continued to be an unpensioned and an uninsured society. So the pool of problems was a bit too many. Who are the insured people? Healthcare and insurance almost run simultaneously. But you had the governmental scheme for its own employees. The public sectors had their schemes. The state governments had their schemes. So out of the 25 to 26 crore families in India, that's about 250 to 260 million, you had about a little over 40 million, 4 crores, who would come really within this governmental apparatus, who had some governmental insurances which are deducted out of their salaries to back them. The others went in for healthcare schemes, but that's still in the process of picking up. And now that we took important steps like opening up the insurance sector to foreign direct investment, a fund-starved sector started getting some investments, some competitiveness with the state sector companies started coming. So it's gradually improving. What is it that we need? I remember in the year 2014, when Delhi was under the central rule, I had an opportunity to present the Delhi state budget in the parliament. And in the state budget, because there's no local assembly, I announced that in each one of the 70 assembly constituencies, we must have a state-funded dialysis center. Now, which approximately means that in a city which is close to about 20 million, 18 to 20 million, we'll have 70 dialysis centers which are state-supported. But the newspapers hailed it as a great revolutionary move, because that was the state of the centers, not in a village, but in the capital of the country. And this is only 4 years ago. So the fundamental principle is that you need resource. And to invest in the social sector, you'll always need more resource. And the Indian economic model, I've been repeating it ad nauseum, is now converging to a situation where market reforms, a market-dominated economy, a more liberalized economy, a bigger economy, a more formal economy, should lead to more revenues in the pocket of the state, because state-supported systems can only come from those additional revenues in the state pocket. If those coffers are empty, then on the 1971 model, you will end up raising slogans and doing nothing to implement those slogans. But aspirational India in 2018 and 19 is very different from the India of 2071. And therefore, you need resources. And I'll share my own experience with you. Many of the moves which in the heat of the moment get discussed, and the discussions are slogan-based, populism-based rather than policy-based, actually the proof of the pudding then is in the eating. It resulted in an interesting phenomena for me, and it was a great learning experience. When the government assumed office and I came into office, only 3.8 crore people filed out of 130 filed a tax return. In this 5-year tenure, we'll be close to doubling that figure. The quantums have also jumped. The first year of the GST added 74% more SSEs. And slowly the revenues will keep on increasing. As far as the states are concerned, they were always running on deficits. Because of this additional mobilization which came from the formalization, and each step helped in that direction, every state today gets 42% of the central revenue, its share. It gets its own 50% share of the GST, plus its own taxes. And from what 50% of my GST share, they again get 42%. And then we have the central sector schemes like Ayushman and for every other sector, where they get additionally. So if you look at the whole cake, for instance, from the GST cake, they end up getting 80%. 71 is assured and the rest is central sector schemes. So we flush them with funds. It's a different matter because of partisan politics. Some of them still are entitled to make comments. They make comments. But that's the big size. Central revenues have increased. And therefore, we looked at the pattern, where do we spend on? We didn't have an hesitation in immediately implementing the 7th Pay Commission or the OROP, which takes years normally to consider. We doubled and tripled the investments we were making into highways and ports and railways. And then we started looking after this essential infrastructure into the social sector. Now, a preventive health program like Swachh Bharat Clean India, from 39% rural sanitation, we moved up to 92%, partly because it became a women's movement in the villages and partly because we were giving 12,000 rupees per every toilet established in a rural home. We had the resources. Roads, electricity, housing, cooking gas, rather than get asthmatic diseases by cooking on coal and wood. So the whole program is now adequately funded. Many of these programs are now coming to an end because once 92% becomes 98 or 99, you don't need to spend, when rural roads are built, you don't need to spend more on them. And for each of the schemes, when the concerned ministry or the Prime Minister's office asked me, do you have the funds? Of course, we made the funds available. And each year, unlike in the past where they used to cut expenditure to meet the fiscal deficit, we exceeded expenditure and yet maintained it and were able to come down. And therefore, now is the time where we've got the cutting edge as far as resources are concerned. And I think now is the time where the opportunity and the resource, the necessity, the belated necessity of spending on these sectors is there. So when Ayushman Bharat and its district level programs for primary treatment, the funds were asked for, we made them available. And now is the challenge of really implementing it. In fact, when it was being conceived, you thought of whether such a scheme will succeed or not. How will the private sector hospitals treat the patients? How will the queues and the footfalls into the government hospitals work out as far as the poor patients are concerned? So one of the alternative models was, instead of spending on this scheme, should you over the next 5 to 10 years spend the same amount and try and build a tertiary healthcare hospital in every district of the country and let the states then run it? Because the state-run hospitals are not necessarily, except for some states, in the best of shape. So then we thought of this model that since you have this expanding institution of both governmental and private sector hospitals, and many hospitals need patients also, and many of them will get an opportunity to develop the expertise as they get the patient population. They'll get an opportunity to expand. More medical institutions will come up. And therefore, you assure them that there is a vast pool of their patients who need treatment, who are avoiding hospitals for want of resources, and therefore provide them with a cashless experiment. A few days ago, almost a week ago, I read that more than 2.3 lakh people in this short period had got hospital treatment. I'm sure the figure would be close to about 3 lakhs now, or if it has not already exceeded it. And I foresee in a full year, in year 3 or year 4, this figure exponentially increasing, because the campaign itself will be picking up, so that the awareness that such a facility is available to you. And this probably would lead to a far greater realization, and the patients going to these institutions, and the institutions themselves, both numerically and in terms of expertise itself, improving. One last point that I wish to make. When we implemented the GST, we created an institution of the central finance minister and all finance ministers of the state. Sit together. We've taken several hundred decisions, 31 meetings, and taken it all unanimously. So a common tax system came up, merging central and state tax by virtue of a federal body which was coordinating it. That's India's first experiment for creating a federal institution. There are 2 other areas which eminently require federal institutions of this kind. The GST was constitutionally provided for. Those areas are not constitutionally provided for. But political maturity can impose on governments to try that experiment. One is healthcare and one is agriculture. The states are spending on healthcare, the center is spending on healthcare. The states have their scheme, the central has its scheme. The states have their hospital, the center is also establishing institutions of excellence across the states. We are doing Ayushman Bharat, they also have parallel schemes. All this needs to be merged so that the benefit of these merged resources now starts falling to the benefit of the patient population of the country. Obviously, it will be implemented through the states with the central coordinating it. And if you have a federal institution, ultimately, this is not a turf issue. Is my scheme better than your scheme? It's essentially a welfare issue, whether the patients in my state are better than the patients in another state, whether they have more facilities. Every state would stand to benefit if this coordination through such a federal institution actually came up between the center and the states. And I think the federal institution experiment of the GST having succeeded, healthcare is an area where there would be the least resistance because it's a welfare targeting programs where we can move significantly a long way in making sure that India remains healthier. Thank you very much. I wish your deliberations a great success.